Thanks everybody for coming out tonight. Tonight we have Dr. Nicole Gunter, who I just found out she's actually from Australia, and now she's in Cleveland. But she's the curator of invertebrate zoology at the Cleveland Museum of Natural History. Nicole received her PhD from the University of Queensland, Australia, for research on the evolution of parasites of the Great Barrier Reef fishes, but transitioned to the field of entomology, where her research has since focused on the evolution of beetles. Dr. Gunter completed postdocs at the Australian National Insect Collection, the Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organization, Australia, and Palacky University in the Czech Republic before moving to Cleveland in 2014 for a position at the museum. Today, Dr. Gunter balances two research programs at the Natural History Museum, one focusing on the systematics and evolution of Australian dung beetles, and the other examining food preference in Ohio's local dung beetles. She is a prolific taxonomist and has described almost 100 species in her career so far, and is also a passionate science communicator. Nicole was recently awarded a prestigious National Science Foundation grant that integrates her research with public education that will bring research and museum collection to the planetariums. Dung beetles are some of the most charismatic and underappreciated insects on the planet.
Who wrote this?
Breeding biology centers around dung, and as such they provide critical ecosystem services through nutrient cycling and more. They're most well known for their association with mammal dung, and their evolutionary successes have been attributed with co-diversification with mammals. This program explores the origin of dung feeding and food preferences of Ohio and Australian dung beetles to answer, do dung beetles feed on bird droppings? Dr. Nicole Gunter.
Thank you. So this was like a really fun talk for me to put together, because normally I focus on just the dung beetles and I don't really think too hard about the types of dung that they feed on, even though this is a core part of my research. I just thought that this would be a really nice twist to focus more on one particular food preference group, perhaps, that is bird droppings. And I really don't know that much about birds, so I'll probably gloss over some of that more specific detail and really focusing on dung beetles. So my core research is very interdisciplinary. It focuses on trying to really understand the evolutions of dung beetles all around the world. And in order to do that, a lot of it is grounded in systematics. That's the study of species and how they're related to each other. So I do a lot of taxonomic work, so describing dung beetle species. I do that using both DNA and traditional morphology. We look at paleontological evidence to try and decipher the timing of diversification and certain traits within dung beetles, using fossils to calibrate some of these molecular phylogenetic trees. I love maps, and I'm really kind of way too into biogeography. That's studying the associations of animals with where they are distributed around the world. As well as a lot of ecological associations, including habitat and both food preference. And being dung beetles, food preference is really quite exciting because poop is everywhere. So there is this underutilized resource that most of the rest of the animals haven't adapted to or even take notice of, but the dung beetles have managed to capitalize on it in a way that is just incredible. So there are more dung beetle species on the planet than there are mammals, and I bet you if I asked you to name some mammals, even though they're not your group either, you could probably list quite a few, but then dung beetles, maybe you might not get more than a couple. So tonight I'm really going to talk about some of these ecological associations and really food preference in a framework centered around birds and the question, do dung beetles feed on bird droppings? Have you ever seen a dung beetle feeding on bird droppings? Well, you never seen a dung beetle? Well, you just have to look harder. Look through poop, and I'm sure you will find one very, very quickly. So when I talk about dung beetles tonight, I'm talking about the subfamily Scarabaeinae. These are the true dung beetles, and this is just one of many subfamilies within the Scarabaeidae, the scarab beetles, that also include some they're pretty common, and you've probably seen them around. So things like June bugs, leaf chafers, rhinoceros beetles. We have a lot of scarabs here in Ohio. And these are part of the superfamily Scarabaeoidea that includes some other charasmatic beetles, including the stag beetles, best beetles, and hide beetles. And this group is different from all other superfamilies within beetles, and they're very easily recognized by their lamellate antennae that are just like little clubs at the end, kind of like mini little reindeer. So if you ever see these little lamellate antennae, you know it is a beetle within the superfamily Scarabaeoidea. So dung beetles get their common name from their association, both feeding and breeding in dung. There are 3 types of functional groups of dung beetles. The rollers that you've probably seen on the Discovery Channel, they roll a ball of dung away where they'll eventually bury it within a tunnel. The tunnelers is the second functional group that will build a tunnel right next to the dung pat that it's in, and then it will grab some dung from the dung pat and drag it into the tunnel where it will undergo the rest of its life cycle. And then there's a third group called the dwellers that perform their whole life cycle within that dung pat themselves. But the breeding biology and the life cycle within the dung ball is exactly the same for all 3 functional groups. So the male and the female will mate. They will form a smaller ball, which we call a brood ball, in which they'll lay a single egg. That egg then hatches into a larvae in which it undergoes its entire development, feeding and breeding. So it has all of the food and safety it needs to develop into an adult there. So it's this really neat evolutionary strategy that its entire life cycle happens in a place that is relatively safe. Eventually, it will pupate, and the adult will emerge from that brood ball and go on with its rest of its life. Am I triggering the... That's really interesting. But dung beetles are most well known for their feeding. Do you want me to go on this side?
She had a question.
Oh, sorry. Question?
I know it's sort of obvious, but they actually eat the dung.
Yes.
Okay.
So they are literally eating the poop, both the larvae and also the adults. Yes?
If the tunnel stays open?
Yes. So it is structurally sound enough, and in fact the males that have horns, those horns are there to block the tunnel entrance from other sneaker males that may come in.
Well, we're asking a question because I almost wanted to know, why do you call them charismatic?
Because look at, well, we'll get to some pictures soon. So we'll get to some pictures soon, and I will explain why.
They get us excited when we look at it right now.
Yeah. But anyway, so dung beetles are most well known for their association feeding on mammal dung. If you've ever seen them on the Discovery Channel, chances are they're feeding on big herbivorous megafauna, so something like the elephant. And there is a whole bunch of them that are associated with these large herbivores and omnivores. But there are a small number of dung beetles that feed on other things, including insect carrion and also mushrooms. But you'll notice in these pictures I don't have anything to do with birds yet. So how do we go about collecting dung beetles? It's actually really lazy field work because we exploit their biology and their attraction to dung and lure them to ourselves. So we set up pitfall traps, which are essentially a small cup that's buried in the ground at ground level, and place a tiny little, almost like tea bag filled with poop that will suspend over the cup. The dung beetles will use their lamellate antennae to smell it, where they quickly come to this resource, fall into the trap, which will have a little bit of preservative at the bottom. Then I come collect it like 2 or 3 days later, and I have lots of little dung beetles in the bottom. So I'm literally selectively trapping dung beetles in these tiny little traps. And this is an example of some field work that I've done here, where I've actually baited 7 different traps with different types of mammal poop, because I'm investigating the food preference of Ohio's native dung beetles here. And I'm going to talk about these sort of food preference studies. So hypothetically, if a dung beetle is in this area, it should cue in to the dung that it finds most favorable. And things like the particle size and also the diet of that animal will really help that selection for dung.
Where do you get the mammal poop from 7 different types of mammals?
So the good thing is the Cleveland Museum of Natural History has the Perkins Wildlife Center. So I get endless supply of native mammal poop. And it's you'll get more details about this later, but it is like literally the ideal place for me to work, because I have colleagues that are like cute little mammals that can provide me poop for my studies. But perhaps this is too much information, but human feces is also a very good bait, and almost all dung beetle biologists are very committed to their science. So dung beetles, there are about 6,000 to 7,000 species. I say that really broadly because probably like bird systematics, there are a lot of synonyms and there's a whole lot going on, but there's a whole lot of new species too. So we don't have a complete count yet because we're doing so much systematics all of the time. But dung beetles come in all shapes and sizes, all colors of the rainbow, from metallic rainbow, so you might have seen the rainbow scarab. We've got blues, greens, reds, the most iridescent, beautiful sheens. Some of them have these really cool horns. If you ever get to see one in nature rolling a poop ball across the savannah, they're pretty charismatic. And even here, if you just spend some time watching them, and they're a lot smaller, well, some of them are pretty small here, they're really cool. They're very underappreciated for the ecosystem services that they provide. Just think about how many deer there are and how much deer poop could exist if we didn't have these little nature's pooper scoopers working in the background to help remove some of this dung. So I'm not going to go into detail about this. This is a lot. But essentially, there are some very strong biogeographic patterns in the distribution of dung beetles all around the world. There are 3 major clades. One of them is America's centric, so there are 17 genera in this clade. Then there is another large group that's found through the Afrotropical regions and Palearctic. And then there's a southern centered clade that has almost half of the genera in it that are distributed either between South America, Australia, New Caledonia, New Guinea, and also New Zealand. And we have these groups that we see the same morphology over and over again, where they're in blue here. This is one that's in South America, and then this is the Australian equivalent over here for this is the group Canthaninae, and this is a South American genus in the Coprini and an Australian one. So you get these morphological counterparts where they look really, really similar, except across the other side of the world. We've done a lot of DNA work on this, and it actually shows that even though these groups look very similar, it's convergent evolution of these exact traits. And there is a really big clade that is monophyletic, so everything has one common ancestor in this clade, and that is all of the Australasian endemic genera, which I work on. And then these 2 groups up here, they aren't that closely related to each other, and they're just spread across the global tree. But basically, there are some very strong trends that still suggest that biogeographic distribution could predict that it's a very ancient lineage. So within dung beetle world, there is still a lot of controversy to whether or not dung beetles evolved in the Mesozoic, which would be supported by these strong biogeographic trends, particularly in the southern continents, or because there's such a tight association feeding on mammal dung that they must have evolved in the Cenozoic along with the mammals. So there has been a ton of papers on this, and they're still split depending on the methods that you use. Unfortunately for most beetle people, there are a very small number of old fossils within the fossil record. There are great fossils within amber, but amber is really too young to date some of these really old ages. So we've got things in the right superfamily and even the right family, but we don't have any old dung beetle fossils. In fact, the oldest potential dung beetle fossil is from this coprolite, which is literally fossilized dinosaur poop. And you can kind of see these tunnels in here that have been attributed to a dung beetle, but who knows what could have made that. But, you know, perhaps it is a dung beetle trace fossil. The actual oldest confirmed dung beetle fossil is one that's about 53 million years old, which is in amber, that's kind of pretty young. But we know that that is a bare minimum age for the dung beetles. So molecular phylogeneticists like me try and use these other older fossils to calibrate a phylogenetic tree of the total superfamily. So I use these really, really old fossils of other families within the superfamily and other subfamilies within the family and place them on a big phylogenetic tree. And you don't need to understand the details of this, but if we only were relying on fossils within the dung beetles, which I have very conveniently color-coded brown, which I thought was great, that we would have so few calibration points in here, it really wouldn't be able to give us any insights to the potential age. And in fact, we know that that one fossil, the oldest one, is like kind of deep in there, so we wouldn't have a older age to really help tie us in. But basically, some of my analyses predicted that the age of dung beetles, the origins, is somewhere between probably about 108 million years and 130. That's a really big age range, but that's based on a 95% confidence interval, and there was a mean that fell somewhere in between. I think it was like 115 or something like that. But this suggests an older date. The very earliest branches within the dung beetle phylogeny, they're actually mushroom feeders, but we get this rapid radiation of dung feeders. And dung feeding actually evolved somewhere between 90 and 110 million years. This is a really interesting time period because it actually aligns with a lot of rapid radiation and diversification of angiosperms, which are the flowering plants. A lot of beetle evolution has been attributed to that. So when I found this result, I'm like, this makes no sense. Dung beetles feed on poop. But then I thought about it more. What happens if the incidental ingestion of flowering plants or plant leaves changed the consistency of the dung just enough, or perhaps it was more nutritious, that allowed the dung beetles to feed? This time period is also too early for diversification or origin of dung feeding with mammals. Although there were mammals that existed in this time, they were small and insectivorous, and their dung would have been small, dry, and pelleted, which would not be an optimal food source. So I predicted that dung feeding actually evolved with dinosaurs, which I think is cool and would make a bit of sense given we saw that coprolite fossil before. But we can't travel back in time, so I'm hoping one day someone will find another old fossil. This phylogeny that I did also estimated the age of the Australasian endemic clade, about 85 million years, and that aligns really quite well with the Gondwanan fragmentation and separation of Australia from Antarctica at that time. So I'm not saying that this is right. I think there needs to be a little bit more more sampling to be done. We'd love some more fossils, but I kind of like these dates, and it really gives some support to some other things that I've been thinking about, particularly within the Australian clade, because evolution with mammals doesn't make sense. And I will get to that very, very soon. And that's because that the mammalian fauna of Australia is mostly marsupials, and marsupials also have small, dry, pelleted dung, which isn't optimum for dung beetle feeding, yet almost all dung beetles within Australia are still dung feeders in part. This is not something that has evolved just randomly. I think it's an ancestral trait. So Australian dung beetles are super cool. They're a great group to study because there's actually two lineages that have very different biogeographic history. So one group, the Australasian endemic clade, is part of the Gondwanan fauna. It arrived in Australia when it was part of Gondwana land and has had its own isolated history as Australia has undergone its landscape change. Then we have a second group, the Onthophagyni, which is part of a cosmopolitan genus Onthophagus that has Indo-Malayan elements. It arrived in Australia probably about 15 million years ago when the continent had drifted far enough north that it could get some of those Indo-Malayan elements coming in through. So even though they're in the same subfamily, these two groups, which have approximately the same amount of species in them, have very, very different evolutionary histories in relation to the habitat of Australia and in relation to the dung feeding that could have happened in the continent for many, many years. So the Australasian group contains species that are found in Australia, New Guinea, New Caledonia, and New Zealand. Some other work that I've done has shown that even though New Caledonia and New Zealand were part of the same continental fragment of Zealandia, actually both of them seem to be independent origins where they've moved from Australia to New Caledonia or New Zealand when those land fragments were closer. We haven't really gotten any taxa from New Guinea yet, and that's just because of the difficulty obtaining specimens, but I've sequenced some museum specimens from other institutions, and they seem to be very derived Australian fauna. But what's really interesting, if we consider the Onthophagus that arrived to Australia 15 million years ago by Indo-Malaya, none of them have made it to New Caledonia, and none of them have made it to New Zealand. This could be one of two reasons. Perhaps it's too far for them to get there, or perhaps the resources aren't there that allow them to feed. And if we think of the mammal fauna of Australasia, the vast majority of richness is made up of marsupials. So these little numbers here are broken down into marsupials, monotremes, bats, and then rodents. So each of them so that's marsupials, monotremes, bats, and rodents. And you can see that New Caledonia and New Zealand only have native bat species. Bats, of course, can fly. Dispersal is probably way easier than a tiny little echidna swimming across the ocean or something like that. But again, this supports the idea that if dung beetles are tied to mammals and mammal feeding, that maybe because New Caledonia and New Zealand have hardly any mammals, why do they have dung beetles there? There might be other really cool, interesting things going on with this long evolutionary history of dung beetles on these land masses. So this is some research done by some of my colleagues looking at feeding biology in Australia. So they're using a 10 different trap, pairwise trap, where they have these 10 traps, each baited with different things. So they have 2 types of dung, kangaroo in this dark blue down here, it's domestic chicken dung in this blue here, 3 types of carrion, including mouse, mealworm, and snail. Oh, and then carrion earthworm here. For fruit, we have banana, cucumber, and pineapple, and then they also have mushroom too. So Onthophagus, which are the recent origins to Australia, they almost exclusively just feed on different dung types. So in these 2 different blues down here. There is one species that is adapted to feeding on different things as well, including mushroom and carrion. But the Australasian endemic clade, they can feed on a whole variety of different things. They're definitely generalists, but they all still do feed on dung a lot, including of birds. And we actually see some of the tiniest dung beetles over and over again at bird droppings. So if you're ever in Australia and you come across, like this is lyrebird dung and it had 3 different species on it, just sit there and examine it, and you might see these little cuties that are really, really tiny. That one's about 3 millimeters. So this is answering the question, did Australian dung beetles co-evolve with marsupials? This is a lineage through time plot. So essentially what it does is it takes a calibrated phylogeny that has a date, and it plots the accumulation of each of these little branches through time. So this is the trend of diversification of Australian dung beetles through time. If this trend matched and co-evolved with a different group, be it marsupials, birds, whatever, we would expect a very similar line that would project along here. So I'm now going to plot the diversification of marsupials. And this is the line that we see. There is no correlation in those slopes. If Australian dung beetles had co-evolved with marsupials, we would expect this line, as we get this uptick here, so about here, to also super rapidly accumulate really quickly. And this is actually the diversification of the grazing macropods, so the kangaroos and wallabies here. So there is no indication of co-evolution with marsupials, which makes a lot of sense because Australian endemic dung beetles are generalist feeders. But again, just dispelling the myth, mammals matter. This is probably popular in this audience. And again, this kind of aligns this lack of evidence that marsupials matter to this ancient dung feeding hypothesis, that if dung beetles evolved feeding on dinosaur dung, birds are essentially just living dinosaur relatives. So it makes a lot of sense, and it also explains why we have just the same amount of popularity with bird dung as marsupial dung in Australia, where there aren't better mammal poop to feast on. So similar studies have also occurred in New Zealand, but so this is a really cool study done by, oh my God, I can't read that. I think his name's Stuart, but this was published in 2014. And essentially they did a very similar food preference studies using New Zealand native dung. So New Zealand, as I said earlier, doesn't have, other than bats, a very diverse mammal fauna. They have a lot of birds and a lot of reptiles. So they use a lot of different native dung types, including the tuatara, which is a reptile, one of the native bat species, and then they have 4 different birds, a kakapo, kiwi, a gannet, a teal, and a weka. I know what a kiwi is, and I know what a kakapo is, and I think a gannet is a shorebird, seabird, but I don't know anything about birds. So, but what I do know is from these birds, this gannet it's considered a carnivore. It mostly is feeding on fish. The kakapo is feeding on seeds and fruit. The kiwi, teal, and the weka are either insectivores or omnivores. So they have a very interesting diet. This study also used mammal dung of introduced species, including cow, pig, dog, the brush-tailed possum, which is an Australian species but an invasive in New Zealand, sheep, horse. They also used insect dung, which I think is really interesting and cool, the fact that they collected dung from insects. And then they include carrion, including invertebrates and vertebrates. So they have dead earthworm, mealworm, locust, chicken, so we have another bird theme here, beef, and squid. So I'm going to walk you through some of this data because this is a kind of overwhelming graph at first. This is an example of one of the native dung beetle species and its time spent at different mammal dung. So these different color-coded dots indicates parts of their biology. So the brown is investigating it, so it's just trying to detect it. If it starts feeding, it's on green. And then there's rolling and burying. So rolling and burying in blue and purple are traits that would be to do with the breeding biology. If they're going to use this resource to breed, they will roll it away and they will bury it. So pink and blue would indicate the use not just for feeding itself as an adult, but it's going to utilize it more to complete its breeding biology. And then while it's just searching around for it before it gets to any of the dung in this graph for the mammals, it's not found it yet, so it is just in red. So that's one of the species. This is the second species, again, with the mammal dung. And this species is a little bit different because instead of rolling it away and burying it, this is a species that is just a tunneler. So instead of having blue and purple, it's just got a purple. But you can see that there is lots of green for feeding with mammal dung, even though these are all introduced species. And there is some investigating that's going on, and there is some breeding traits that happen in purple or purple and blue. But there is a lot of time searching for the mammal dung in this case, and less time searching for it in this instance. So let's have a look at the other types of resources that they tested. Again, with the two species, and we're focusing here on all of the bird dung types for both of the species. And again, you can see a lot of feeding on bird dung and a lot of, for both of them, and also a lot of breeding points as well. So they're definitely utilizing bird dung too. What's even cooler about this data set, and if you remember that there aren't that many mammals around, like, it's super cool that of all of the carrion that they're really going to and feeding on, it's always the chicken. So this paper actually goes in to mention that perhaps because New Zealand has so many shorebirds that breed, and I think they mentioned something like 15% of the chicks would die in this nesting, there's probably a lot of bird carrion that is just lying around, and there's not that many scavengers that might pick it up, so the dung beetles can feed on it. But what's cool is they're just feeding. There's very few dot points in here that are the blue or the purple, so they'll feed on the carrion, but they won't breed on it. So I think this is really neat that there's some definitely more association going on with the evolutionary history of New Zealand dung beetles and birds. And this really comes to light too here if we look at, so this is the carrion group, the invertebrate dung group, the mammal dung group, and this is mostly the bird dung group. The time that they spend searching for the resource for this species, it's really long compared to the birds. These dung beetles are cued into that dung. They find it really, really quickly, and they're straight there. So not only are they primed to feed on it, their little antennae are so honed in to getting there quick that they're like so tight in here that they can detect this very, very quick. So I think that's a really interesting thing to consider. If you're co-evolving or co-adapted with something, you really want to be able to recognize it really quickly. So this is pretty neat to show that there is a tight evolutionary history with New Zealand dung beetles and New Zealand birds. So if you get to go to New Zealand?
Your x-axis is time in minutes?
Minutes? Yes. So it's pretty neat to consider. So what about dung beetles here, where we have lots of mammals and there's lots and lots of food? This is a little bit of my studies on here in Cleveland. So the best thing about my research program, working in Australia and here, is that I get double summer because of the hemispheres. So I can do 2 research programs. So I utilize the poop from all of the Perkins wildlife animals, and the Natural History Museum also has about 60 different preserves and 12,000 acres of land that we protect. So I go out to these little preserves and I'm setting up these little food preference studies with a little side project that I call Whose Poos Do Ohio's Dung Beetles Choose? And it's really looking at this kind of like, of all of the native mammals that we have and the small number of dung beetles that we have here, are our dung beetles generalists or they're specialists? What's really going on? This project is also really good because I can use it to train students and we can get solid results in a very short period of time. So these studies have been going on for about 4 years now. I usually do them with undergraduate research interns. We have a paid undergraduate program called the Kurtlandia Research Internship Program that pays for 8 weeks of salary. So if you know any undergrads who want to work at the museum with either myself or some of the other researchers, let them know that we have a paid research internships. So these are the 3 main dung beetles that I collect pretty regularly here. So we have Ornithophagus hecati, which is the scoop scarab. He's about the size of your little pinky nail. If you ever see coyote poop in the forest and you pick through it with a stick, you'll probably find this little guy. Very easy to recognize because it has this big projection that goes from its pronotum across the rest of its head. It's a dull matte color. Then we have Ornithophagus striatulus, who's this almost looks black but has a copperish tinge. This one is very easily recognized by the cute little cow horns. And then we have Ornithophagus orpheus, who looks pretty similar to Hecate, has a bit of a projection across its head too. It's less elongate, but this one is this like beautiful reddish, shiny metallic color. Sometimes it's also greenish. So 2 years ago, I did this study on the Grand River terraces with 2 different students, and they each had 7 different baits. Each of them had 5 baits in common, so coyote, bobcat, raccoon, gray fox, and hare scat. One of the students also used otter and deer, and the other one used mushroom and red fox. So you can see this is Ornithophagus hecati, and while in this one, otter was its favorite dung, coyote was its favorite dung here, but again, generalist. Striatulus really liked otter dung too, but when otter wasn't available and mushroom was replaced, it loved mushroom, and we know that Striatulus is a mushroom feeder. And then Orpheus, which is quite an uncommon species, it seems to have a really strong preference to gray fox. And what's really cool about this result, particularly this one here, we used coyote, red fox, and gray fox in these preferences. And there are 39 that we collected in total this 1 year, and I think at least 30 of them came to gray fox. This is particularly interesting in a conservation framework because we know that gray foxes are declining. So what does that mean for poor little Orpheus? I'm more invested in this story. But, you know, perhaps this is not the audience that really wants to know about gray foxes, but when I found out I was doing this talk, I think we organized it just before I started my field work. I'm like, what animals should I use this year? So I repeated this year, but we used bird poop. And I was really excited because we have sandhill cranes, we have owls, we have ravens at the museum. So I'm like, yeah, I'm going to get all of their poop. Turns out they don't like to poop that much in ways that we can easily collect it. So I refocused and we used Canada goose poop. So my whole little lab group, we went down to Severance Pond and we collected a lot of goose poop. But I bought them ice cream beforehand, so it was fun. So we did this survey at Crosshaven Preserve, which is a recently acquired property in Novelty. We used coyote, bobcat, raccoon, grey fox, deer, mushroom, and Canada goose poop. And we didn't get as many specimens as we did the year before, but Onthophagus hecati, the scoop scarab, never came to goose poop, but it did come to Onthophagus striatulus. So this here is mushroom. Almost half of the specimens that we got of this species, it was feeding at mushroom, but goose poop was equally as attractive as coyote, bobcat, and raccoon. So which is really, really cool when you think about their generalist feeding trends, and then a lot of dung beetle people and also a lot of mammal people are like, mammals are the only thing that matters. I just think it's because we're so used to trapping with mammal poop that no one investigates this and a potential correlation with dung beetles and birds because it's not the obvious thing to think about.
And nobody ate deer poop?
None of these guys wanted deer poop in this. We have the false dung beetles that came to deer poop the most popular. So, which was, I mean, dung beetles in general prefer the dung of omnivores over herbivores, and dry pelleted dung is not the best. Yeah, who hasn't tried it? But anyway, in conclusion, dung beetles feed on bird droppings, yay! And really, it's quite a common trait in island systems where there isn't a diverse mammal fauna. So Australia does have a diverse mammal fauna with great poop. New Caledonia, New Zealand, Mascarene Islands, and all through, I'm blanking on the names of those islands. There's a whole group of island chains off Africa's coast that also have not that many, Mauritius, there we go. But in other areas, dung feeding on bird droppings may actually occur, but we haven't had a chance to investigate it that much. So we really need to do more thorough surveys to understand of those dung beetles that are generalist feeders, are they just as equally generalist feeders on birds and mammals, or is there more of a preference towards mammals? But as we think about this further in a broader context, it's not just their ability to feed on these resources, it's whether or not their attraction is tightly linked. Do they have the correct receptors on their tiny little antennae to cue into that bird dung quickly and then beat out the competition? So I encourage you all, when you're on a birding outing, particularly in a region that there aren't that many mammals and there's lots of poop, just take a second and maybe look for these little cuties. And with that, I'll take any questions. Yeah?
What do dung beetles do with their own poop?
That's a really good question. So they probably don't utilize it that much for breeding because it's so small. When they have to build a brood ball, they need a big enough resource that an adult can eventually form within it. But we think that the microbiome of dung beetles is really essential to the next generation. So there are some studies of some weird Australian dung beetles that don't so much use, they kind of make a mini compost heap with dung and rotting fruit, they incorporate their own frass, which is insect dung, into those brood balls. So there is a little bit of evidence, but I don't think there's really been a study explicitly on that, but it's a really interesting question. Yes?
Who's their enemies? I mean, who eats the beetles? What eats the beetles?
So this is why their evolutionary history is so successful. There are so few mammals or birds that have really specialized into dung beetles. Within Africa, the fennec foxes have, so they queue into those little dung beetle tunnels and they'll dig up the dung ball and then feed on the juicy little larvae inside. Birds will eat dung beetles too. I've seen a picture of a robber fly feeding on a dung beetle, but it's just like there is not that much that is specialized into feeding on them, which is pretty cool to think that maybe their evolution is so successful because no one bothers eating their little larvae in a poop bowl. Yes?
But, like the one thing that stood out was the one that there were coyote, gray fox, and red fox, and the beetle zeroed in on gray fox. But don't those three pretty much eat similar diets? I mean, what do you attribute that to?
So they probably have similar diets, particularly red fox and gray fox. I know that coyotes often eat larger vertebrates. This is also based on the diets that we feed the animals at the zoo, and I know that, like, for example, our coyotes get whole rats, and that the gray foxes have a more insectivorous, fruit-based diet. So they're all definitely omnivores, very well-balanced diet, but it's to do with both the particle size, probably the scent. So a lot of these foxes have like a really musky smell that's probably specific to them. But I think it's really interesting that there's niche partitioning happening even within dog species here. And the way that I like to think about it is if Ornithofagus hecati is the much more common and abundant species here, and it's slightly larger than Ornithofagus orpheus, it's also got a bigger scoop, why would you want to go to its favorite food? Because then you have to compete with it. So if you go to something that's probably just as nutritious for you and you're going to have more success competing for that resource, you're probably going to have more success with your own offspring. So it's like just natural selection randomly happening. But it's really cool. Yes?
Yeah, I was wondering, kind of follow up what he was asking, something like goose poop, would it have more nutritional value to a dung beetle than gray fox poop? And obviously there's not nutrition labels on these things. Is there a preference based on the nutrition level or just the competition?
It's probably a lot of both. So there are a lot of dung beetles do prefer the dung of omnivores, and that's probably because there is some protein in it. It's probably like the consistency is way better. If you've ever seen carnivore scat, it's much drier. So there's kind of like a sweet spot with the moisture content of the dung and the protein level and the odor. So there is a whole lot more research that really needs to get into it, but it's neat that we're beginning to see these pictures, even with such a basic field surveying.
I was thinking that something like bird poop and reptile poop might have a higher uric acid content, which you would think might be a deterrent.
Yeah, so that is actually a lot of the original hypotheses on like why dung beetle coevolution must have occurred with mammals. It was all based on the idea that dung beetles don't feed on bird droppings, and bird droppings are so high in urea that there is no way that they could have co-evolved, or like this dung feeding could have evolved in them. So that high urea concentration has definitely been an argument that's been made over and over and over again. But the truth in the matter is the smallest dung beetles, it doesn't seem to bother them at all. And perhaps the dung beetles are so small because bird droppings are so small and their histories have been so tightly aligned to each other that the dung beetles are just getting smaller based on their resources. Yes?
Has anyone looked at the volatiles that are coming off of the dung? I mean, I'm thinking about this in terms of like bark beetles where there are terpenes and things coming from the tree and then kind of seeing the chemicals off the beetles themselves. Have people looked at that so that you know what their lamellar antennae are picking up on? Because all this other stuff, the nutrient content, whatever, it's like you're not going to pick that up, but you are going to be able to, when you're out there flying around looking for dung, you're going to smell something. And so these things are clearly attracted to different volatiles. And I'm just curious what people have been doing in that front.
Yes, so there has been a lot of research that has been happening, particularly within the agricultural field with the volatile organic compounds and their attraction and the olfaction connectivity. And they've like coupled it down to like, they'll even like publish the little like chemical models of it. It's not so much a popular field of study in all dung beetle groups, particularly ones that don't have an agricultural benefit. That's because we have like 6,000 to 7,000 species, and I would love to be able to do all of this research. I just need to find the right labs. Yeah?
Any research on dung beetles and cat and dog poop?
I don't know about research, but I know that the dung beetles that we have here, particularly Hecate, will feed on both of them. So we were getting them at bobcat and coyote and all of the other canids too. But if you have dogs in your neighborhood and you're not picking up after them, you will get Hecate utilizing it and turning it over. So, and I think that there are a number of people who keep dung beetles as pets, and they say to feed them cat or dog poop. So I don't keep dung beetles, so I've got that going for me. Yeah.
Are dung beetles affectionate?
I don't think so. We can't anthropomorphize them, but I like to say that some of the best examples of biparental care within insects occur within dung beetles. So there's my favorite group, which is an Australian group. They do really heavily invested biparental care where the male and the female will work together to build the tunnel. Then they'll go and collect dung and they make the little compost heap. They add more dung to the brood ball as the larvae grows. And the larvae makes this cute little squeaking sound inside the ball, which is probably just still alive, add more food. But then it's like they stay with those larvae until they emerge as adults. So there is like a heavy investment with their care for their offspring. This group only produces 3 to 6 or so larvae each year for a parent, whereas some of the other dung beetles will lay like 40 or more, and they'll just like spread them everywhere and just like, you know, you're safe, see you later. So there's different levels of biparental care.
Do you raise dung beetles at the museum, or it's all out in the field?
Yeah, it's all just wild. We don't have facilities to be able to keep them. And even though it would be cool to do in lab experiments with feeding and attraction and time, and like if I did that resource study like in a smaller like wilderness style, I would probably get some really neat results too. Question in the back?
How old are the scarab beetles that are in Ohio? How long have they been evolving? Because I was thinking the coyote and the Canada goose are kind of invasive species at this point. So maybe they just haven't been familiar enough with it for long enough to zero in on that, as opposed to red foxes and gray foxes have been here, but I'm assuming
the ones that I have data for are all Onthophagus, and they are part of that one cosmopolitan genus. That group originated in Africa and is probably one of the younger groups. So the whole tribe is probably about 60 million years old, and it came out of Africa. So it probably, and like I don't have real numbers to this, but my educated guess is probably like they've been here for 40 odd million years. It's a long history. But we do have other groups that I don't have the data for that are part of the neotropical fauna that has moved upwards. So it'd be really interesting to look at their food preference in comparison.
Like Canada, where Canada's have been for a long time, or out west where the coyotes have been.
Yeah, it's really interesting just to think about like those long ties and what, all ecosystems change. There's got to be give and take and adaptations along the way. So like if dinosaurs were their original food source and then dinosaurs went extinct, what happened? Were they all generalist feeders at that time and it didn't really matter? They just adapted and then they took off with mammals. Was there a loss of dung beetles at the same time? There are so many questions to think about that we don't have the answers for. Yeah, question at the back?
Yes, I'm curious if anybody's looked in any of the Cretaceous ambers, getting to your phylogeny calibration questions. I know that there's some in New Jersey where they found like the earliest ants. There's also ones in Southeast Asia where they're getting amazing things like dinosaur feathers and cool stuff like that. I don't know if anybody's looked at those yet. I know there are people actively working on that, like Dave Grimaldi at the American Museum. So just curious if they found dung beetles yet.
So dung beetles, their biology isn't the greatest to have large numbers of them ever attracted in amber. When we think about the beetle groups and the other insect groups that are really, really well represented in the amber record, it's things that are often associated living their biology on a tree trunk. So ants get well preserved, bark beetles, a lot of the other groups that spend a lot of time in an area that they're likely to get trapped in amber. We have great, great, great fossil records. The ones that we have for other groups that are found in different places, it's just incidental entrapment. So we unfortunately don't have we don't have a really large number of fossils, but what we do know is the ones that we are finding are actually quite deep in the phylogenetic tree. So we have lots of representation along the tips, but nothing old enough to really be able to help us calibrate. So I wish that like Burmese amber, we eventually get a dung beetle. That would be fantastic. But I just don't have high expectations because they're not a group that's going to have to be spending a lot of time that increases their chances of being entrapped. One day, I'll hope.
You said some dung beetles originated in Africa and are now here?
Yep.
How did they get here?
It's like a lot of like biogeographic connections have been formed through time, land bridges. They've just really been able to colonize the world quite well. Their old age too. A lot of these land masses were a lot closer or the climate was different. So I wish we could, if like everyone who has ever asked me, like if you could have a superpower, what would it be? I'm like, time travel. I want to go back to and learn about dung beetles. But yeah, there's a lot to be learned.
So I'm curious about, of course, in Australia, I don't really know all your climates there, but of course this is a very cold climate for part of the year. So what happens to them? I mean, they seem to be really prolific, like in Papua New Guinea and in parts of Africa and the south of the U.S. But when it's cold climate, do they burrow, stay on the ground? How do they survive through a winter weather?
So they are all great questions. Within Australia, the vast majority of diversity are in the tropical regions or the subtropical regions. We also have alpine areas that are higher elevation. There are not that much diversity there. And Tasmania, which is really far south, also doesn't have that many. Here, I don't think anyone has ever spent that much time trapping through winter, but I assume much of their overwintering strategy is it's the larval development within the brood ball at the time, so they're not out there actively foraging. The good thing is if they're burrowing underground, they have a little bit more protection from the elements, but I can't tell you off the top of my head here if there are any active dung beetles in winter because I've never done that field work. And I imagine that more of the problem would be that as dung freezes, those volatile organic compounds probably don't have the same amount of time to disperse, and then you've got to have probably the right weather. So my best guess is it's most of their overwintering strategy is the development in the brood ball at that time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Gonna get some?